All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. Today, or in this lecture, I guess, we will be continuing our discussion of realist fiction at the end of the 20th century. Realist fiction sort of meeting the challenges posed, or at least attempting, if you don't think it's good, attempting to meet the challenges posed by things like postmodernism and postmodern experimentation and the rise of genre fiction such as science fiction that we've also seen in this course. And now we want to turn from Raymond Carver's dirty realism, his minimalist realism, to magical realism. And this is a concept, magical realism, that I've mentioned a number of times already in this class because it is a feature, I think, of that multiculturalist moment in American literature that also coincides with the end of the 20th century, as you'll see. And I mentioned it in the context of writers like Toni Morrison and August Wilson, who did use magical realism, but not really, and were renowned for using magical realism, but not really in the works we read. So I wanted to give you an example of magical realism that was a kind of a straightforward example. And instead of talking about it in the section of the course on multiculturalism, I thought it would make more sense to talk about it here in the section of the course specifically devoted to transformations of realist fiction in this period. So our example of magical realism will be Louise Erdrich's story, Fleur. Now, Louise Erdrich is a local author, as August Wilson in part was, who spent his adult life around here in the Twin Cities. Louise Erdrich was born in 1954 in Minnesota. So you see, we're going through time. The writers are getting a little younger, that we've had a lot of those 30s births I was talking about throughout the course, including most of the authors this week, but Erdrich is a younger writer, a baby boomer. Born in 1954 in Minnesota, her father was of German descent, and her mother was Ojibwe, and she is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians and a graduate of Dartmouth and Johns Hopkins universities. And her fiction is characterized by its magical realism and by its participation in the Native American Renaissance, which we mentioned 2 weeks ago when we discussed Leslie Marmon's Silko. So Silko, Erdrich, these are writers writing at this moment in the wake of the 60s liberation movement, which included the American Indian movement as part of it, writing in this efflorescence of Native American fiction in particular that arises starting in the late 60s through the 70s onward. And her fiction is known for its magical realism. It's also known for being interconnected, and what I mean by that is that all of her novels take place in one kind of fictional world. That's, I don't mean in a fantasy sense, it's set in the real world. It's set within mostly Minnesota and the Dakotas, largely among the Ojibwe and also white, the white population of that area. And, she portrays it as this vast, interconnected, intermarried community. And so all of her works, all of her short stories and novels tend to take place in this one overarching community centered on a couple of families. And her novels themselves tend to be made up of short stories. So her novels have this kind of fragmentary, multi-viewpoint quality. And almost all of the short stories in them can be read as standalones, but then they add up to the greater whole that is the individual novel, and then each novel, adds more to the ongoing story. I don't know if that's 100% true of every single one of her novels. She's very prolific, and I haven't read by any stretch. I haven't read them all, but I've read, a few of them. And they all tend to be in this interconnected universe. And so that's one thing that characterizes her work. Magical realism, which we'll discuss in a moment, is another. And then, and I did mention that sometimes she has been criticized for not being overtly political or activist in her writing. And Leslie Marmon's Silko, in particular, made that charge, that her work was too... for Silko, and you'll remember Silko's story, Lullaby, was a realist story, fairly straightforward, set within the perspective of one character that sort of was emblematic of a certain kind of Native American experience. And I think Silko's charge was that Erdrich's work, in some of its magical realism and some of its play with viewpoint, and particularly the way that the stories in her work sort of add up to narratives, but the narratives are non-linear. So, for instance, one of the ways Erdrich's novels tend to work is they're made up of these stories and they hop around a lot in time. So you could cover 100 years in one of her books. And so there is an experimental postmodernist quality to Erdrich, as well as a realist one. And I think Silko's charge was that this kind of experimentation took away from a more activist approach. And that returns us to a question that's come up a couple times in this course, which is, I think we started looking at this question with Philip Roth's work, which is, what does the writer from a marginalized or oppressed group owe to that group as a writer? Are you obligated to use your writing for the purposes of activism in the way that an Adrienne Rich or a Gloria Anzaldúa, or in this case a Leslie Marmon Silko, wants to do? Or should you regard, I think the way Erdrich thinks about it, I mean, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think the way she thinks about it, and I think the way a writer like August Wilson, who's talked about this, thinks about it, and the way Philip Roth thinks about it, is that the way to resist this group level marginalization and oppression is to be a free member of your whatever group you're a member of, and stand forth in your creativity and in your full humanity. And that is a kind of that's a radical enough political gesture if you are marginalized on the basis of a group identity, to sort of stand forth in your cultural and individual freedom and humanity. So that's not a debate, we can resolve in this class, and that's going to be a decision that each person will have to come to, how they think about that. But it's definitely been something that's been talked about with regard to Erdrich's work. And she currently lives in Minneapolis and manages Birchbark Books in addition to her writing, so she does own a local independent bookstore. I don't think it's quite, I've never actually been there. I don't think it's quite in the city. I think you have to kind of go out of the city. I don't know exactly where it is, to be honest, but maybe worth checking out. And then I wanted to point out, as I always do, I have some quotations. In this case, I have two quotations from the introduction in the Norton Anthology. And what they do in there is they usefully point out something, which is that her writing style is really a multitude of styles, but it kind of exists at two poles. One of the poles is clarity and directness. And in fact, I often think of Louise Erdrich as being in part herself a part of that dirty realist movement. She wrote with unsparing clarity about the working class and lower middle class lives of her characters in this, Minnesota, Dakota's world, both Native American and white. She writes with unsparing clarity about this sometimes gritty life. And she often writes in their voices, which are very colloquial, very conversational. She tends, she writes about all social classes. She often writes about people who don't have access to formal education in the same way that Raymond Carver does as well. And so there's this clarity, this directness, this colloquial energy, this vulgarity, this profanity that often comes out in her writing on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's this extremely lyrical, poetic style. And she's a poet as well, which they emphasize in the Norton. And they reprinted some of her poems, which I didn't assign, but you can check them out if you want. This very, very charged, elevated, poetic, lyrical language. And so her writing sort of exists between these extremes. And I think that is the stylistic signature of her magical realism too. She has this realist voice that's direct, that's clear, that's colloquial. And then she has this more magical idiom that sounds like that of the tale teller, of the bard, of the poet. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out. And then the other excerpt, I think, just repeats what I've said, which is that her interest in the interaction of quirky, passionate, complex individuals, Native American, mixed blood, German American, or Anglo, lies at the center of her fiction. And she does. It's hard to get a sense of Erdrich from one story because the effect of her work is sort of cumulative. It's this enormous cast of characters that she's almost writing this one giant, like a 1,000,000-page novel about. But I do think this is a great story, Fleur, and it does give you a lot of the sense of what she can do. All right, so moving on, I just want to revisit for a moment the definition of magical realism. It is a broad label for 20th and 21st century fiction or drama or film. I mean, or comic books. It extends across media, but it tended, I think it was, well, it was originally coined to describe a certain style of painting, actually. And then from there, it migrated into a discussion of prose fiction, and then from there into drama and film and other things. But it's a broad label for 20th and 21st century fiction that has two characteristics. It is set in a recognizable social landscape in the way that realism is. Realism is about everyday life. So in that sense, it's realist. The magic element comes in where there's some quality to the story or the novel or the play or whatever of the fantastical, the supernatural, the surreal. It's hard to pin down exactly. And by the way, most people don't like, most writers who are called magical realists don't like this term. I think writers, I think we've talked about this in this course, writers don't like to be labeled, and so they resist these labels. I think Toni Morrison famously said, I don't write ist novels. I don't know what you're talking about with ist. I'm an artist. I'm a free artist. I write what I want. But nevertheless, we, as critics, as scholars, as intellectuals, we look back and we retrospectively group things that are alike together, which I think is a fundamental feature of the human mind. So they might not like this word, but I think it's a useful description for certain things. So again, it's set in a recognizable social landscape. That's the realist part. It's everyday life. But there's a supernatural, fantastical, or surreal element as well. And I think I Google image searched magical realism, and I found this nice painting that I think captures it perfectly. You have this normal everyday street scene, and it's snowing in the city. I think we've all seen that. And yet there's this angel walking down the street. And I think that's a great example of what magical realism is in one image. Now, it is an international style, so it's not a particular style of American literature. And in fact, American writers tended to borrow it from really two sources. Latin American literature is where it really came to prominence in world literature in writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Jorge Luis Borges. Who wrote some of the pioneering magical realist novels and stories. And there's also an Eastern European and Russian element, particularly associated with writers of the Jewish diaspora like Franz Kafka and Bruno Schulz, or with writers who lived under Stalinism like Mikhail Bulgakov. And so it tended to come into America with writers who were either sometimes of the broader international community. So Jewish writers like Philip Roth would sometimes write magical realism, out of an influence by authors like Kafka. So it tended to, there are diasporic groups that have these affinities. Similarly, Latin American Latino writers would borrow from the Latin American tradition. And then also it had an influence on writers like August Wilson and Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich, like African-American writers, Native American writers, because I think the idea, so why did it arise in places like Latin America, among Jewish Eastern European citizens, among Russians who had lived under Stalinism? Well, because I think the idea is that in a situation where you are being oppressed somehow, whether it's because you're a member of a minority group, like Jewish people in Eastern Europe, or whether it's because there is a state bearing down on you, like the totalitarian government of Stalinist Russia, or some of the fascist governments of Latin America, or other places that magical realism was prominent. For instance, was India and Pakistan, where there's, first of all, a post-colonial legacy, and then at times dictatorial governments after that. If there's a place where there's this sense that you are being oppressed by this overbearing force, a majority, a state, one of the features of that is that there's a definition of reality being imposed from above upon you. The state or the oppressor, the imperialists, the fascists, the colonizer, whoever it is, the dominant culture is telling you this is what reality is. And you, whatever you think reality is, We don't care. We're in charge here, and we're going to wipe out whatever you think reality is, and we're going to impose our reality on you. And so magical realism, I think, is an attractive literary and artistic genre for people, for members of groups who are oppressed in this way, because it becomes a form of resistance to reassert their own sense that, number one, reality is more than what you, the oppressor, say it is. And number two, it's a way of encoding into literature and art these spiritual or cultural beliefs and practices that are being suppressed. What looks like, and this is a real reason to object to the term magical realism, what looks like magic, which is a term that seems like it's closely related to the irrational or the superstitious, what looks like something you can dismiss as magic to this crushing dominant culture might be the spiritual practices, the spiritual beliefs, the religious way of life of the community being oppressed and dominated. And that's why I think magical realism has this attraction for minoritarian or oppressed groups and peoples the world over, whatever the kind of nature of the oppression is. And I think that's why you see it arise in these circumstances of Jewish Eastern Europe, Russia under Stalinism, Latin America under imperialism or under fascism, South Asia under imperialism, and then minority groups within the United States, like Native Americans or African Americans. And as you can see, as I mentioned here, it's, I think in what I just said, you can hear this, it overlaps with postmodernist and multiculturalist beliefs. Just like multiculturalists, it asserts a plurality of ways of life, and just like postmodernism, it calls into question grand narratives and challenges grand narratives of what reality is. And I think Erdrich's story, Fleur, is a really good example of how this works, because what happens in Fleur is that you have a story, on the one hand, set in a recognizable social reality. It's set in this town in 1920 in, I guess it's in North Dakota. Did it say in the story? I don't remember. Sorry. I don't always remember the details of these many, many things I ask you to read. I'm setting a bad example, but I think North Dakota. It's set in this town, and it's set in a town, and nothing in the story couldn't happen necessarily by the laws of physics, I think, except for some of the stuff that happens at the very beginning with this idea of drowning. But the basic story, and it's kind of a grim and brutal story on the one hand, but it's also one of the things that's hard to get used to with Erdrich, for some readers, though I think it's something that's kind of attractive about her to others, is there's this quality of dark humor about her work where she has these storytellers. She usually uses first-person narrators, and she writes in many different first-person voices. So in this one, we have this narrator called Pauline, and the narrators often tell these really over-the-top, violent, sort of horrifying stories in a tone that's often at least partially comic. So this kind of mismatch between the tone and the events described, this kind of tall tale aspect, that is what's being told, is this very grim, gritty social reality. So we have this here. So we have this character, Fleur Pillager, and the narrator begins by telling us a little bit about her background, which is that she sort of quote-unquote drowned a couple of times, and the first time the men who saved her quickly died, and then the second time this guy didn't tried to stay away from her, but she said to him, "You're going to end up like me." And so he tried to avoid it by not leaving his house, and then he fell in his bathtub and died through like drowning in the tub. And so, and as you can hear, that's like horrible, but it's also so over the top, it's a bit kind of tips into comedy. And I think that's something that's a feature of her work. And so Fleur Pillager, why is she this way? Because she has some relationship with the Mishapeshu, the waterman, the monster. So that's why she keeps almost drowning, is because there's this godlike creature or demon-like creature, this monster, who is a feature of Ojibwe spirituality. And I put on the slide from my source is the Canadian Encyclopedia, the Ojibwe or the Chippewa or Anishinaabe. I think these terms tend to be used interchangeably. Are a transnational group. They overlap the United States and Canada. The most important underwater being for the Ojibwe is Meshepeshu, which means the great lynx. This fantastic dragon-like animal resembles a feline with horns, symbols of his power. It has palmed paws that enable him to swim fast, and his back and tail are covered with scales. Meshepeshu lives in the depths of big lakes. Although he has a feline shape and is amphibian, he is always described as a reptile. He is feared by all Ojibwe because he is the cause of waves, rapids, and whirlpools, and he even breaks the ice in winter, thus claiming numerous victims. So, Fleur is sort of fallen prey to this monster's desire for her. And for this reason, the Ojibwe community around her want to run her out of the village. And not only that, but because she, in other ways, transgresses their social codes. So she dresses like a man. She goes out on these hunting expeditions, and they say she's a shape changer and changes into a bear. So she's this figure of total fluidity, hence her association with water. She's fluid between genders. She's fluid between animal and human. And so she is this creature that is distrusted in the community. And one of the interesting things about the story is you don't quite know if that is... I think in the story you're invited to take that seriously. That is this a fully human woman, or is there some supernatural element to her? And the way the story is told, I think, credits the idea that there is this supernatural thing that you have to take seriously. And I think that's where magical realism becomes a way of getting into modern fiction the spiritual beliefs of peoples who are marginalized in the broader world. Because what is Erdrich doing here but passing on these Ojibwe traditions? And she does it in the story through the voices of women. So there's also a gender element, that culture is passed on through the voices of women. So our mothers warn us about Meshepeshu that we'll think he's handsome, for he appears with green eyes, copper skin, a mouth tender as a child's. But if you fall into his arms, he sprouts horns, fangs, claws, fins. His feet are joined as one, and his skin, brass scales, rings to the touch. You're fascinated, cannot move. He casts a shell necklace at your feet, weeps gleaming chips that harden into mica on your breasts. He holds you under. Then he takes the body of a lion or a fat brown worm. He's made of gold. He's made of beach moss. He's a thing of dry foam, a thing of death by drowning, the death a Chippewa cannot survive. And you hear there what I mean when I say that Erdrich has this lyrical, poetic tone as well. She writes this kind of prose poetry of this catalog of this monster's both alluring and frightening features. And so our character Fleur Pillager is associated with this waterman, this monster who wants her for himself. So this is the stuff of myth. This is the stuff of lore, of spirituality. There are stories like this throughout the lore of the world, and yet it's being presented in this modern realist setting of this short story. So what happens? Fleur leaves her community and goes to this town in the 1920s, when it's still a pretty rudimentary place, when the upper Midwest is still being settled by whites. And she works in this slaughterhouse. And so the Erdrich gets a lot of mileage out of this imagery of the smokehouse, the slaughterhouse, these deadpan lines about Fleur's boiling heads, the heads, literal heads of cattle. And so we have this this sort of idiom of meat throughout the story. And in the slaughterhouse, she begins to play cards with the men who work there, these single men, and they are sort of helplessly drawn to her, but they resent her because of the way she never quite loses at cards. And there's this rising tension in this narrator, a narrator who's apparently at this time a young, maybe, I don't know if she gives her age, but like a teenager is watching this. And she says that she's invisible because the men aren't attracted to her. So we have this very incisive commentary of sort of male sexual domination on the literal level, even as on the spiritual level of the story, it's treated through this this sort of sexual demon, the Mishapeshu. Now, the men play cards with Fleur, and eventually she wins the whole pile. And this leads to the final confrontation where they chase her, and she escapes the one for a while who's attacked by this pig. So she's sort of associated with nature. Nature comes to her aid in the form of this pig who attacks this man. But he finally escapes, and she runs into the smokehouse and is set upon by the men, and they presumably sexually assault her while our narrator watches and doesn't help. And I think that's one of the key moments in the story, because we're told that the narrator, Pauline, is also of Native American descent, presumably also of Ojibwe descent. And she doesn't help Fleur in this moment. She stands by while she's raped by the men. And she says, I went stiff with fear and couldn't unlatch myself from the trestles or move at all. I closed my eyes and put my head in my arms, tried to hide, so there is nothing to describe but what I couldn't block out. Fleur's hoarse breath, so loud it filled me, her cry in the old language, and my name repeated over and over among the words. So we have this failure of solidarity on several grounds. Gender grounds. She's not able to help a fellow woman as she's attacked by these men, and this failure of solidarity of Ojibwe relations, even though she understands Fleur's cry in the old language, and she understands that Fleur is calling her name. Now, what does happen eventually, though, is that just as other men who got too close to Fleur met bad ends because she has this association with Mishapeshu, so there's a tornado that comes and attacks, I don't know if attacks is the right word, but comes over the town, and Pauline locks the men. So the men run for shelter into the meat freezer, into the meat locker, and Pauline goes and finally, she couldn't help Fleur, but she avenges Fleur. And for the crime of raping Fleur, she locks the door of the meat freezer, and the tornado comes through and flings the meat freezer under this giant pile of rubble, and they're not found for 3 days, and then when they're found, they're frozen to death, ironically sitting at the card table trying to stay warm. And it was that card game that incited and provoked their attack on Fleur. And so Fleur and Pauline and sort of outraged nature itself has its vengeance on these vile rapists. They get their comeuppance in the form of this death. And so this, though, repeats the pattern that we've seen at the beginning of the story of men who get too close to Fleur are killed. And the way the story ends is very striking. Power travels in the bloodlines handed out before birth. It comes down through the hands, which in the pillagers were strong and knotted, big, spidery, and rough, with sensitive fingertips good at dealing cards. It comes through the eyes, too, belligerent, darkest brown, the eyes of those in the Bear clan, impolite as they gaze directly at a person. In my dreams I look straight back at Fleur, at the men. I am no longer the watcher on the dark sill, the skinny girl. The blood draws us back as if it runs through a vein of earth. I've come home, and except for talking to my cousins, live a quiet life. Fleur lives quiet too, down on Lake Turco with her boat. Some say she's married to the waterman, Mishapeshu, or that she's living in shame with white men or Wendigos, or that she's killed them all. I'm about the only one here who ever goes to visit her. Last winter I went to help out in her cabin when she bore the child, whose green eyes and skin the color of an old penny made more talk, as no one could decide if the child was mixed blood or what, fathered in a smokehouse or by a man with brass scales or by the lake. The girl is bold, smiling in her sleep as if she knows what people wonder, as if she hears the old men talk, turning the story over. It comes up different every time and has no ending, no beginning. They get the middle wrong, too. They only know they don't know anything. And so the story ends on this postmodern, on the one hand note, but on the other hand, very unpostmodern note. So what's the unpostmodern note first? Power travels in the bloodlines. So this is a story that believes in kind of racial genetic inheritance. This is not a story that deals too much in kind of postmodern anti-essentialism. This is a story that believes, I think, that human beings are what their ancestors were, and that we're living out a kind of fatedness determined by our birth. And you do often get this sense in Erdrich's work that people are working out family destinies, that individual lives are just the fatal enactment of certain familial patterns that you can maybe break out of, but maybe really can't. And so that's not very postmodern, is it? That's a kind of a conservative idea in a lot of ways, that you sort of are what the generations before you were. So there's that. But then the postmodern part is that it's hard for people to say whatever really happens in life. So even though we might be sort of chained to our racial destiny somehow, our family destiny, nevertheless, the actual events of life are mysterious and baffling, and they intersect with metaphysical and supernatural forces in ways that are hard to explain. And so the end of the story is Fleur has a baby, and you don't know whose baby it is, or even if it's a fully human baby. Is it the water man, the water monster, Mishapeshu's baby? Is it the baby of one of the men who assaulted her in the town? Pauline, the narrator, doesn't know, can't tell us, and says nobody else knows. And everyone is just telling the story. So we're all just telling stories from our partial and limited point of view that just shows that we don't really fully ever know anything. And I think this story creates a very authentic air of the mysterious, almost the epic around these everyday events that I think is such a great example of magical realism in practice. And so that's magical realism. That's Louise Erdrich, and that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much.